Jerome Bruner, American psychologist, 1915 to 2016. Bruner was born in New York City, in a suburb of Manhattan. He was born on October 1st in the year 1915 to parents who were Reformed Jewish in their faith and of German descent. From early in his life, Bruner had struggles to overcome. He was born blind, suffering from cataracts. When he was 2 years old, he had an experimental surgery that removed the obstructions to his sight. For the rest of his life, however, he had to wear thick Coke bottle glasses that would make him feel self-conscious. Most who remember him make mention of these glasses as contributing to his overall scholarly look. In her remembrance of him, Bruner's former student, Patricia Greenfield, said, "He once said that during his 2 years of blindness he had constructed a visual world in his mind. Those early experiences may help explain why in the 1940s and 50s he developed the groundbreaking theory that perception is controlled by the mind as well as by the senses." His father passed away when Bruner was 12, and he moved with his mother to Florida. As a student, he was proficient in mathematics. He enjoyed history and reading. Upon completing his exams, he made good enough marks to be given a place at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. It was during his time at Duke where he was introduced to the topic of psychology. After completing his undergraduate degree, he went on to study at Harvard, eventually earning his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1941 when he was 26. During World War II, Jerome contributed to war effort as a social psychologist who focused on examining propaganda and how propaganda related to social attitudes and public opinion. While at Harvard, Bruner found himself surrounded by some of the country's leading minds of the field of psychology, including Henry A. Murphy and Edward Boring. Despite all of the influential scholars and teachers he was surrounded by at both institutions, Bruner never established himself as anyone's student or devotee, instead opting to take inspiration from a variety of sources and shape them into his own ideas. After receiving his degree from Harvard, Bruner joined the faculty and became a founding member of the Center of Cognitive Studies. Through his early career studying psychology, Bruner realized that there was a commonly held idea in current psychology that he did not agree with. The idea of behaviorism bothered Bruner, and he pushed back against it. The example of Pavlov's dogs is the most colloquially held example of the theory of behaviorism. A dog learns to ring a bell and receives a treat so much that when it rings the bell again, it salivates, even without a treat being provided. Currently, psychologists tend to side more with Bruner's theories than the former behaviorist theory. Bruner argued that the human mind is not passive in the learning process. Bruner believed that stimulus did not equal perception. In fact, the theme of much of Mr. Bruner's work is expressed in his phrase, the battle against passivity. Bruner was persuaded by Edward Tolman that behavior was purposeful and should be described as a map, and that learning changed the knowledge. It was a radical claim for the time in the world of psychology. As stated before, Bruner believed that stimulus did not equal perception. All of these new theories and ideas that Bruner and his colleagues were developing later became known as the cognitive revolution. In the past, psychology only focused on the study of the brain and behavior caused by the brain. The mind was too spiritual, too flighty, and too difficult to measure to be able to be scientifically studied. Furthermore, knowledge was thought to be a topic for philosophy, not for the empirical study like psychology. But Bruner took the study of the mind out of the ethereal sphere and into the scientific one. He studied cognition in a new and inventive way. Bruner's cognitive work suggests that the growth of the cognitive awareness was not simply tied to the acquisition of more information, however, the invention of more and different forms of representation. A focus on representations, symbols, and model building in an explanation of mental life assured a stream of distinguished visitors, including Ernst Gombrich in 1960, who argued that making comes before matching, and Nelson Goodman in 1978, who argued that you have to make what we find. Working what Bruner Working with Bruner, they developed a new understanding of the relationship between what was represented and representation. In his article, David Olson points out that the example of the surrealist artist Rene Magritte's famous work, This Is Not a Pipe. It is a painted image of a pipe, and underneath it is the phrase, This is not a pipe. Magritte's work is the first confusing to the viewer because, of course, this is a pipe, and then the viewer realizes that it is just a representation of a pipe and not an actual pipe. This is an example of the type of work and the cognition that Bruner was working on. In 1956, Bruner collaborated with Jacqueline Goodnow and George Austin to publish a book called A Study of Thinking, which helped formally spark the cognitive revolution. Bruner himself considered this book to be his most important. The central premise of this book, arguably his most important contribution to psychology, is with the ways in which a person carves up the world into nameable categories. Along with his fellow psychologists, Bruner devised new experiments that were designed to study the way people infer concepts and categories, for instance, of color and of shape. The subject of Bruner and Company's experiments ranged in ages from infant to adult, but it was his work with children that shaped the next couple of decades of his career. What they discovered was that thinking was not random. There are strategies involved, and the strategies demonstrate an understanding of what is possible. This body of knowledge was thought of as the cognitive map or a cognitive structure. During this time, they conducted a series of experiments on infants that proved Bruner's theory that infants are capable of control and intentionality. The process of education. Jerome Bruner was first and foremost a psychologist. That is what he is known for. However, he also made a name for himself in the field of education. Through his discoveries in cognition and studying culture, Bruner was able to make correlations between his work and education. It was during a conversation with the distinguished physicist Gerald Zacharias that Bruner got the idea to look into education. At the time, there was a dissatisfaction with the field of education, leading the United States Academy of Sciences to sponsor a workshop which some 27 disciplinary experts, curriculum designers, educational researchers, and developmental psychologists were invited. Somebody from this illustrious group was needed to be responsible for writing up the proceedings of the workshop. That person was Jerome Bruner. In 1960, he published the greatly celebrated book, The Process of Education, which would become a centerpiece to the most educational models in the United States to this day. Although the book is less than 100 pages, it became an instant bestseller and drew comparisons of Bruner to John Dewey as a revolutionary in the field of education. Education at the time had become a battle between the progressives who were inspired by Dewey and the traditionalists who were committed to teaching subjects to children. The process of education was a revelation because it challenged preconceived notions of achievement. It also offered striking new proposals for engaging students, or as they were called in the book, learners in their own education. Using Bruner's previous discoveries in cognition to apply to the field of education, proving that young children, even infants, were capable of level of cognition and will. Bruner himself stated, as far as there was anything revolutionary, it grew out of the cognitive revolution. Schools of the time had been accused of offering too little for the mind by an educator of the time. Bruner put it a little more tactfully, saying, what may be emerging as a mark of our own generation is a widespread renewal of concern for the quality and the intellectual aims of education. In Process of Education, Bruner speaks to three big issues that he perceives in modern education: its discontinuality from frontiers of knowledge, its disinterest in intellectual structures of the classroom activities, and its conception of knowledge as a continent in the expense of process. His contribution and organization of the book catapulted Bruner into educational stardom. Soon he was an almost constant contributor to many different educational boards and conventions. On these committees, Bruner argued the revolutionary claim that even young students can appreciate complicated subject matters such as governmental organization and higher order math concepts like the theory of probability in an intellectually appropriate way. He suggested that concepts should be taught to learners using actions, icons, or symbols in that order, depending upon their age. If education was to be elevated and taken seriously in the academic world, it must be made a high priority, as it should be in a progressive and modern country. Teachers and students alike must be allowed to participate in growth instead of simply put on a show or performing rote memorization. Educators should be working from the newest available sources of knowledge, and they must be enthusiastic about their discoveries with their colleagues and with their students. The lack of intellectually appropriate subject matter created an education system that Bruner saw as low esteem applied art, a kind of useful but non intellectual activity. His second point regarded the intellectual structures that were advocated for in the classroom, which Bruner pulled from his cognitive revolution days. For Bruner, perception was not caused by a stimulus nor by knowledge caused by a lesson. Perception and knowledge were the result of the activities of the learner and the perceivers, and the learners were seen as advancing and testing hypotheses, not just recording and storing of facts. Using the precepts set forth in the book, children were able to insert their own hypotheses. They were able to make their own interpretations and to use those interpretations to determine the lessons. They were able to determine what the lesson meant to them as opposed to being told what to think about it from a textbook. Lastly, the traditional concept of knowledge was challenged. Before the cognitive revolution, the publication of the process of education, knowledge was viewed the same as it had been for millennia, stating that knowledge was a set of authorized truths that could be found stored in books, which were passed down from one generation to the following generation. After the cognitive revolution, knowledge was a product of ongoing inquiry, the process of asking new questions and encouraging the search for answers. The students have the opportunity to conduct themselves as scientists. As Bruner explained, schoolboy learning physics is a physicist, and it is easier for him to learn physics behaving like a physicist than doing something else. In the preface to one of his later books, Bruner expresses surprise that his book that went against the empirical nature of education in the United States would amass such a devoted following. What can be distilled as one of the most important things that the process of education did wasn't necessarily its revolutionary take on education. It was instead it was most powerful in that it ignited a renewed interest and a passion for education in those who read it. In the process of education, Bruner continually points out the lofty intellectual goals that educational institutions should pursue, while at the same time looking for methods to make these goals easy to achieve and understand. This goal can be achieved when basic level understandings are developed into ever-increasingly difficult understandings. Students are encouraged to go beyond the information that is given to them. This way, students not only hold on to information they are provided, they are given more control of their own learning and can make it their own. The revisiting of topics at the more advanced levels is the basics of spiral curriculum that was popularized by Bruner in the process of education. Bruner believed that all children were capable of understanding complicated information and should be entrusted to do so. While spiral curriculum was popular, it was easy to be misused. It was easy to hear that the spiral curriculum is just repeating topics every year until the student leaves school. However, it is imperative that the subjects are taught from a new perspective and with increasing complexity. Despite its complexities, one can see evidence of the spiral curriculum still present in modern classroom in the United States. By examining Bruner's contributions to education and psychology up to this point, it is evident that he holds a constructivist theory of education. Constructivists believe that students are in part responsible for their own education and are responsible for building upon their education. Constructivist ideas fall within the progressive and liberal education spectrum. Another important tenet of constructivist theory is that students should use cultural tools to acquire knowledge. Students use their current or past knowledge to be an active participant in their learning. This mirrors Bruner's early work in which he asserted the mind of humans is not passive. An educator in the constructivist theory holds the idea that the educator and the student should engage in an active dialogue, similar to the Socratic method. Meanwhile, the job of the educator is to translate information into an age-appropriate format. The curriculum should be organized in a spiral curriculum arrangement so that students can double back on what they have already learned and gain a new perspective. In other words, students are actively participating in construction of their own education. There are three main tenets of constructivist theory. First, instruction is directly related to the experience and situations that made the student ready to learn, proving their readiness. Secondly, instruction is to be structured so that it can be easily understood by the students, like what is done in spiral curriculum. And lastly, instruction should be designed to facilitate extrapolation or fill in the gaps or going beyond the information given. In the 1970s, Bruner joined the committee at Woods Hole that was involved in the creation of a new curriculum. Um, the MAN, a course of study, or MACOS, or MACOS for short, which combined the appeals that Bruner made in the process of education and the commonly held belief that the theories may be ambitious, they should not be so ambitious that they are unattainable. The goal of MACOS was to improve the teaching of social studies in the middle grades by developing a new curriculum that combined recent developments in the sciences of anthropology, psychology, and evolutionary biology, and of course on the nature of man as a species. There were three main questions that MACOS was interested in answering. Firstly, what was unique about human beings? Secondly, how did they get that way? And lastly, how did they continue to be so? There are many young researchers who were involved in this project, including Howard Gardner. The goal of MACO's curriculum was to develop a framework from which students could gain an understanding of the social world. What is interesting to note and what sets MACOS apart from the other curriculums at the time is the emphasis on getting students to think. Learning to think critically was the main purpose of this curriculum. MACOS was not widely accepted, and there was some criticism of the curriculum. Conservative educators attacked it as being too cross-cultural. For more widely, it was criticized for being too difficult to carry out. There was a large degree of educator preparation that was needed and was hard to begin using. In addition to institutional pushback, the difficulty of training teachers, it was difficult to motivate students and get them to buy into the curriculum. All of Bruner's work with education was getting him noticed by more and more institutions and individuals. In the 1960s, Bruner worked with the Johnson administration in the fight against poverty. He was also drawn into working with the United States government in the formation of an early education program known as Head Start. The program was started for obvious social reasons. It was clear that the students who came from less privileged or poor homes were at a distinct disadvantage when they arrived at school. Head Start was created in an effort to remedy this situation. Not only was the purpose of Head Start to fill in the gap made by socioeconomic status, it was also used for research purposes. Bruner had already proven in his work with cognition that babies were active learners. There was more psychological study that was needed and wanted. There had been animal studies that indicated that when an animal was raised in an impoverished situation, they delayed learning, and the same could be expected to be experienced by human children. It was in this gap between active learning infants and their impoverished surroundings that the delay in learning ability was created. Head Start was introduced to fill in the cultural gaps. Bruner expanded more on this topic in his book, The Culture of Education, where he goes more in depth about the different cultural environmental challenges that could have negative effects on young children. He even decries racism as a major factor for the setbacks children experienced in racism or poverty because of racism, because at the time it was an interesting notion to assert since it was the time of the civil rights movement. While Bruner was an advocate for the program and served on the committee, he did not play an active role in the implementation of the program, instead playing a role of committee member and advisor. Head Start was based on the idea that if preschool children could have access to richer environment than they may have at home, they would be more intellectually developed and more prepared for formal schooling. Unfortunately, trust in the effectiveness of the program and of early interventions in general began to be questioned when research showed that the advantages did not have a lasting effect. Bruner disagreed with the diminishing faith in early education interventions, and he argued that inadequate results were not fair summation of the effectiveness of the program because the criteria used to evaluate them were limited to simple skills. He urged that those criteria should have included the growth of an interest and thoughtfulness about the world and a willingness to share those experiences with others, which again points us to Bruner's other work in education, specifically the belief that learning should be self-motivated and not a repetition of facts. Because of the general sense of disappointment surrounding Head Start and the Vietnam War underway, funding for the program was significantly limited and many programs shut down. Recent reevaluations have shown that if interventions are continued over a longer period, they do indeed have a cumulative and long-lasting effects. Bruner would continue to be an advocate for early intervention programs for the rest of his life. Head Start created a new consciousness, or tapped a faith right under the surface of consciousness, that by intervening in the developmental scene early enough, you can change the life of children later. We can see that currently most of the developed countries in the world agree with Bruner and have robust preschool education programs. In 1983, Bruner wrote an autobiography in the form of essays called In Search of Mind. Howard Gruber, a fellow psychologist, reviewed Bruner's book and called it a fun book by a serious man. Unlike other autobiographies, Bruner shortens what would be a mini-chapter inner dialogue about a dissolution of marriages into 3 sentences. Indeed, his personal life was not much of the focus of his book. Instead, the book was another way to process his psychological work. Gruber attributes the fun of Bruner's book to his colorful personal life. Bruner was married 3 times and was an avid sailor who set sail across the Atlantic Ocean when he moved from Oxford to Harvard. After teaching for 27 years at Harvard, Bruner took a position at Oxford, which he held until 1980, when he returned to the States and continued studying psychology. In 1991, he made a wild switch in academic schools and began teaching at New York University School of Law. He brought a new sense of wonder about human mind to NYU Law in the 1980s, where he delved into the relationship among law, culture, and society. Jerome Bruner was a pioneer in many fields. He wrote or co-wrote 14 books about psychology and education. It is hard to examine a movement or a program in academia in the 20th century that doesn't have at least a small amount of Jerome's influence on it. There are many towering figures in psychology today that hold Bruner as their greatest teacher, Howard Gardner and Patricia Marks Greenfield being just 2. He was admired by many of the most well-known scholars, psychologists, and educators today. Howard Gardner recalls about Bruner. He was a psychologist of possibilities. He opened one door of the mind after another, and then moved on to something different. He added he was the most important contributor to educational thinking since John Dewey, and there was no one like him today. More than anyone else in the 20th century, Jerome Bruner paved the way for behaviorism to cognitive psychology. Perhaps Bruner's greatest accomplishment was bringing a renewed interest to the way students think and are taught to think, and to reigniting a passion for education in educators and society at large.